my name is Anne Sevier. It's a Flemish name. My family arrived here in the New Forest about 1650 and took up commoning straight away, because commoners then, they had their milking cow and their livestock out on the forest. So I can now call myself a 13th generation commoner.
Fantastic.
I took over the mantle of commoning about 40 years ago, where I started looking after the ponies that we had out on the forest. When my parents died, I then put cattle out on the forest. I would calf rear and then turn them out on the forest. But I have had to give that up now because I'm too old.
So your commoner's rights is, have you got a farm or?
Yes, I'm lucky enough that the family farm still exists, and it has quite a nice bit of land with it, though some of it has now been sold, but it belongs to my brother and my sister and myself. It was agreed last year that we sold more land off, and I'm able now to stay in the farmhouse for as long as I wish, because the problem is that land is very expensive here and properties are very expensive here. And I'm sitting in a property that's probably worth nearly £1 million.
So you've still got common rights,
yes,
which are attached to your remaining land?
Yes, so I have forest rights, grazing forest rights.
Right, so the forest rights are actually different from commoners' rights around the edge of the forest?
Yes.
So I understand that you are, as well as being a commoner, you're also a verderer?
Yes, indeed I am, yes.
Anne's ancestors arrived just after the English Civil War, when hope for greater equality for the common people was rising. The forest had been designated a hunting ground by William the Conqueror and was protected by forest law. Its primary aim was to protect the monarch's hunting ground, the vert and the venison, which included hunting deer, boar, hare and wolf. And there was a judicial system in place to enforce the forest law, the Court of Attachment hearing minor cases, and the forest heir the most serious. The Court of Attachment and Swain Mote, presided over by a Verderer, had no authority to impose fines or punishment. That was the forest heir's responsibility. In the past, forest law had huge powers. The penalty for being caught hunting deer was removal of the first 2 fingers so that you couldn't use a bow and arrow. And repeated offences meant you could be blinded as a punishment. The penalty for removing a fence a 3rd time was transportation. Although the forest heir was supposed to hold court in the forest every 3 years, it was held less and less frequently, and in 1670 the last ever court was held. This was largely due to the progressive relaxation of forest law. Without the forest heir to hand out punishments, the Court of Swain Mote and Attachment lost most of their power. As early as 1217, in the Charter of the Forests, there was some recognition that the rights of common people to a livelihood had to be protected against the sole rights of the Crown. But it wasn't until 1877 and a reconstitution of the Verderers Court that commoners' rights were acknowledged by the forest courts. The Verderers Court in the New Forest still exists today.
There are 10 verderers. One is appointed by government and has to be signed off by the king. That's the official verderer. We then have 5 which are elected, and if you own an acre of land on which common rights exist, that's either common commons or forest commons, then you can have a vote. There are then 5 appointed positions. One is from the National Park, and that's my position. And then we have somebody, Natural England, and knows his stuff. We have a Forestry Commission appointed verderer. And then we also have a DEFRA appointed verderer to deal with animal welfare.
So that's quite interesting, because that kind of gives us an idea of how many organisations are involved in the running of the forest. So the Verderers Court has open sessions that anyone could go along to?
Oh, absolutely anyone can go along and make a presentment about the open forest or anything that happens on the open forest. But it is always quite interesting. Last time we had quite a few presentments because people were concerned about Forestry England giving permits for food outlets on the open forest. That has still some way to go, because a verderer's permission is required. But in this case, there is already ice cream, people selling ice cream and things, so it was very difficult. But we will just have to wait and see. From the verderer's point of view is damage to grazing, so it must be in the right place, and also the fact that people may start feeding the ponies and then get injured.
And what about regulating the grazing? So people using their grazing rights?
There can be breaches of bylaws. For example, you're not allowed to have a male pony on the forest after 18 months unless it's been passed as a stallion. That's to keep the breed lines clean and clear. Sometimes you can't catch it, but that is a breach of the bylaws. So that may come to the verderers that this commoner has not been able to get this colt in, and so we don't automatically say, oh, that's, you know, come down hard. We just say, just get them out there and get the darn thing in.
And in terms of numbers of stock out here, do people have a specified number of stock that they're allowed to graze?
No, they can in fact turn out as many animals as they wish if they have rights to turn out for grazing on the forest. Most people don't, because the difficulty is that they need land in the winter time or buildings in the winter time. So it's a long time since we had anybody. I think in the 1960s Mr. Dalgetty turned out a couple of thousand, which had come down from Scotland, because he bought some quite wild Black Aberdeen Angus. But that was before the cattle grids, and a lot of them actually ended up being killed on the roads because they weren't fenced. So it wasn't quite as successful as he hoped it would be. That's one of the reasons why people in and around the forest can keep cattle and ponies, because they can turn them out onto the forest, cattle in the summertime, ponies most of all year, and then they can use their land to make hay or silage or set it aside for winter grazing. So that is what commoning is about, really, using the commons to your best ability.
Yeah, for your summer grazing, basically.
As far back as the 1600s, the gentry bought cottages because of their common rights. They could afford to overstock, because when the pasture ran out and in the winter, they could just move their animals onto their own land. The poor cottagers couldn't.
So basically the numbers of stock on the common are naturally regulated by the amount of land they have to graze
in the winter time.
In the winter.
Yes, many young people would like to be commoners, and if they've got the family land, they can common, which is what I did when I took over the ponies. But the problem is, once the older people like me die, the properties are often split up and the money goes. Which is what happened with the farm I'm sitting in at the moment. When that is sold, it'll be bought by somebody probably from Surrey. Well, I mustn't malign Surrey unnecessarily, and want to turn it into a bit of Surrey and not really look after its intrinsic local value, and that will be lost to commoning.
But I couldn't afford to buy a piece of land. What would be my
then you wouldn't really be encouraged.
Right.
You wouldn't be encouraged, because the land is what you need. For example, every few years strangles, which is a bacterial infection, comes through the forest. And if you had to take your young pony off because they had strangles, then you need somewhere to put it, which comes under the verderer's remit, making sure we keep the forest clear of unnecessary diseases.
I mean, going back to the land issue, that in itself could be a problem with the price of land now.
Yes, a few years ago when we sold some land, it was £25,000 an acre. An acre's not much.
No.
It's not much at all.
No. So in terms of new people coming into commoning, that is going to be a barrier, I would have thought.
It's a barrier. It is a barrier. Yes. Yeah. They would need to have a piece of land with common rights, because that's why I'm not keen to sell our land with the common rights on it, because then I wouldn't have common rights.
Yes. Exactly.
So I would be stuck.
Yeah. So there's no way of selling rights separate from
No,
land?
it was agreed, there was a big inquiry in the mid-1800s and an atlas was drawn up, and every piece of land on the atlas is marked about what right it had. The majority of the rights are pasture rights. You have to pay to put your animals out on the forest. At the moment it's £26 an animal, it's £26 an animal. It pays for the adjusters. So enough money must come in on the marking fees to pay for the adjusters if we want 5 adjusters.
But your role is basically voluntary then?
I'm voluntary, yes. I am a National Park verderer, so I have an allowance from the National Park, which is not very much, but it goes somewhere towards it. It's to encourage people to come onto the National Park. But all these things are not set up for younger people. They're only set up for the older people like me who've retired. Can I go now?